Well, Andrew, thank you for sending in your video here at Sonoma Raceway. I had a look at it, and to be honest, not a bad baseline. There's a few things I see that we can work on definitely to improve your lap time and to be a little bit more consistent towards that high 46 range. That's going to get you closer to the front of the pack. So let's start the video here. We'll have a glance at the first turn. I see you're running in the opposite direction. So we'll have a glance at the first turn. So we'll get the video started here. And I'm going to run through and just let it play out all the way through the first turn, and then we'll kind of come back and look at how we can improve. So there we are, turn one, Sonoma reverse. So the line itself, the entry and the exit, not bad. That's a really solid foundation. But I'm going to turn the volume down here. We're going to rewind just a little bit to the start of the lap. Now I want you to really pay attention here to the middle of the corner right about now. Now, if we look at our steering input, we have a little bit of back steer. The kart is on the trajectory of going a little bit off the track. So if we look at our line here, we can draw a little line for you of where we're pointed. The front of the kart and the wheels are pointed off the track, where we really want to have that kart pointed more up the track, following. You kind of see that rubber line, that black rubber line. We're kind of going across that line now. So what happens is we start to get that little bit of a slide, and as the kart pushes up, when we want to go back to power, we're still not going to have that solid drive because the kart has been sliding sideways. So the big question is, how do we fix that? So we're going to clear these annotations real quick here. And we're going to look back and see how we can improve this a little bit. So let me rewind here. Sorry. Let me rewind here just a few seconds, and we'll go into turn one. So the biggest reason for this little bit of oversteer that we start to get right after initial turn in is because we have too much brake pressure at that point. And it could be a little bit to do with your brake bias. I don't know what brake bias setting you're running with, but if you have a little bit too much brake pressure towards the rear and you're heavy braking at this point, it could create a little bit of oversteer as you're releasing the brakes. So one thing to test is a little bit more front brake bias. A lot of people, especially the pros in shifter, will run close to 70, 80, even 90% front brake pressure. You know, I know some of the top drivers at the world championship level in KZ are running, 70, 80, 90%. It's all to everyone's liking, but it's definitely above that 60% front range. So it's all to your liking, but as you start to challenge these brake zones, and you'll kind of see going through this whole lap, that's where we can kind of really find some improvement. You're going to want to start dialing some front brake bias in there. So we missed that a little bit. So how do we rectify this? What we can do is brake a little bit harder initially going into turn one, maybe even be able to brake a hair later. But what that will allow us, when we brake a little bit harder initially, it will dig those tires into the track a little bit harder. It will load the front. So when you start to turn in, you can actually release that brake pressure. You'll still hold the brake into the corner, even to this point, just before you come off the brake to go back to throttle, but you won't have as heavy brake pressure at that point. That will give you a little bit more stability going into the corner. Another thing you can maybe try, if you continue to get this little bit of oversteer so that we can get down to our apex, is turning in a hair earlier with slower hands. So you see the closest we really get to that curb, and we had to add some extra input in when right about here. Now we're even oversteering again. And again, that's because we're turning twice for the corner. We can get another foot, 2 feet closer to that curb and have a little bit better trajectory. So we'll let this play out. We'll continue through here. Turn 2, 3 here, honestly, it is pretty solid. The minimum speed through the corner could be increased a little bit. One thing I want you to try is turning a little bit earlier and getting closer to this inside curb. So I'll give you a little annotation here. We want the cart to be a little bit closer to this curb right here. And the reason for that is obviously the track is worked in both directions. You drive it in both directions. But you can see here on this second line, this is where the rubber really is. Out here in the gray, we don't have as much grip. So we want this outside tire to be more in the grip here, okay? That's gonna give us the most grip. If we're outside that grip, we're gonna have trouble being able to carry as much minimum speed as we want through this corner. And you may be trying to run a little bit off that just to keep it a little bit wider to have a better run out. But I think you can actually run a hair narrower and roll more minimum speed through the whole corner, and you can find a little bit of time there. So again, we'll play this through with no sound just because it's a little bit easy sometimes to do it with no sound, a little bit less distraction. So as I can see your trajectory, you're trying to make it kind of two corners. And I like you having that nice arc through there. But if we're in the rubber, we're going to be able to roll more minimum speed through that corner because you get a nice launch off here, use the track properly. I really like that. So if we go back to turn 2 and 3, experiment a little bit. Experiment with getting down to that curb, trying to roll a little bit more minimum speed through the corner, take a slightly narrower line, and see if you can actually roll more speed through the corner. You're going to pick up the throttle at the same point of where you're picking it up now. Just that little bit narrower line in the grip is going to allow you to carry a little bit more speed. So now we're here into turn 4. I'm going to turn the volume back on. We're going to get going through here and see how this looks. Again, pretty solid. But if we're going to go back, I'm going to turn the volume down here again. Let's look at how close we are to this apex curb. Again, we get a little bit of oversteer before we even get down to that apex. And you can see, again, the cart is pointed off the track a little bit. The cart's sliding. That's minimum speed that we're losing. And of course, maybe your tires are a little bit worn. Maybe the track's cold. But in the end, as a driver, it's always our responsibility to try to get the most out of the cart and keep the cart underneath us. So as we play this through here again, you do a great job of using all the track, managing that grip. It's not a big slide. It's very minimal. But again, if you do that in every corner, and even if it's 2, 3, 100ths, if you have 10 corners, that's 0.2 of a second right there. And that's the time that we're, really getting close to being on that cusp of the high 46 range. So even just these small little mistakes, they add up. And once they add up, it's a big chunk of time. What I'd like to see here, honestly, is maybe just a little bit earlier turn-in, a little bit slower input. Again, your line's not bad. Or brake release, I'd have to see the data to really understand the brake release. I can't see your foot that well, and it's hard to really know how quickly you're coming off and how much brake pressure you have at that point. But you could maybe try to turn in a little bit earlier, and that would help just a little bit. You can't turn the wheel quick, and you do have smooth hands, but if you turn a little bit slower, a little bit less input, you may be able to get that into the grip a little bit better, and you won't get this oversteer on the exit. Going through the S's here, good straight hands, making that as straight as possible as we come in here to turn 6, I guess we'll call it. So turn 6, especially this direction, it opens up on the exit. Where the opposite direction, it kind of continues to tighten a little bit, doesn't open up as much on the exit. So your line is going to be pretty close to what you're doing. The opposite direction, you can kind of dive in and diamond the corner up a little bit. So let's bring the volume back up so we can hear your braking and throttle application, and we'll get rolling. Great job managing the oversteer there. One of your smoothest corners, and honestly one of your best corners on the entire track. What I do see though is as we come back here, I think we can brake a little bit later. We can change. Don't really hear much tire noise. We can brake a little bit later. And in this style of kart, if we can brake just a hair later, be a little bit harder on the brakes initially, challenge that brake zone, you can find 1/10 of a second in the brake zone here and not give up any exit speed. You're doing a good job. As we can see here, you're right on the apex. The hands are straight, minimal oversteer. Honestly, that little bit of oversteer is, especially with the rock tire, which I assume you're running, and Sonoma, doesn't get that much grip unless there's a big event there. That's really just the slip angle of the tire that you're working with right there. So that's quite solid. Good drive off and into turn 7. So I'm going to rewind a little bit. Turn 7 is one of the corners where I really see actually that we can improve quite a bit. It's one of the corners actually probably with the most improvement. So I'll let this play through and let's just have a listen. So probably your biggest moment on the track with the most amount of oversteer. A lot of that is with throttle application, but a little bit of it is we're not getting the kart rotated further around the corner. So when we go back to power, we have straighter hands. So I'm going to turn down the volume again so we can talk this through and look at this. So we go in, we can definitely brake a little bit later. Again, good, but actually we can maybe angle a little bit more, come in at a little bit more of an angle to challenge the brake zone so that when you're turning into the corner and you're coming off the brakes here, so let me get my arrow. I'd like to almost see the angle of the kart more like this. Okay, so you would almost turn a little bit before you go to the brakes and have the kart a little bit more angled going in so you can brake in a straight line and brake as deep as possible. And that's going to give you a little bit more efficiency on the brakes that will allow you to brake harder and later. If you ever watch a lot of the top drivers or you watch any of the videos in a shifter kart compared to the tag racing, you can run a shorter line into the corner and a little bit narrower line and really challenge that brake zone and use that brake release in the middle of the corner to rotate the kart, because it's very hard, especially in the slower corners, as you know, to pick up the throttle really early because you'll get wheel spin or oversteer like we get here. So more time can be gained by challenging that brake zone, getting it rotated, a little bit straighter hands on the exit so you have really good forward drive with those rear tires. So if we can get the car pointed a little bit more at an angle when we go to the brakes, we can brake a little bit deeper and still carry that good entry speed that you've been working on. So as we come in here, let me get the video to play again. Good amount of input at this point to get the kart to turn. I would like to see more of that turning happening, especially with the Sodi kart that does have a very positive front end. I'd like to see a lot of that turning done with the brake release and a little bit further into the corner. If you see here, if you were to really have the kart rotated at this point, you would be aiming straight for that curb and you'd mob that curb. So I would like to see less input at this point. And we come through here, again, still good amount of input. We haven't been able to straighten it at all. So if we can come in a little bit narrower, a little bit more at a diagonal, we can really start to rotate the kart just before this point. And then when we pick up the throttle, I want you to listen to this. Let's listen to that throttle application. Pretty aggressive. So I don't know how many springs you have exactly on your throttle, but maybe you need a little bit heavier spring so that in these slower corners, especially as you're really trying to get after the throttle, that we're not jumping on the throttle. So I've always, when I raced shifter karts when I was younger, I always had to run a few more springs or an extra spring than most people until I really learned that throttle application, how to be nice and smooth with my foot. That will help a lot because that wheel spin there, that big slide, that there alone probably cost you 2/10 on this lap. So, you add up those small little mistakes and this wheel spin, that's 3/10 right there we found. And if this is, a lap that's pretty close to a 47.2, even close to your lower 47s, now you're in the 46s. So that nice smooth application and challenging the brakes there will really help you. So we'll continue on to the final corner here. Again, actually real quick, I do see you're using the track nicely. You're getting out to those curbs. I really like it. Great line here, down to the curb, minimal input. Now, that's a very solid last turn, but we can improve that even so. And watching some of your other laps, we were a little inconsistent with how we took this corner and where we picked up the throttle. This is one of the laps that you pick up the throttle the earliest, and I do like that. My only concern is that we're giving up a little bit on the entry here, by not being able to brake maybe as deep. Maybe we can brake half a cart later, still get on the throttle, maybe not half a cart later, maybe just a foot or two later, and that will give you a little bit better entry speed, a little bit of time gain there without losing any on the exit. Just listen to your acceleration out of the corner here. As you can see, going through the corner, because you picked up the throttle a little bit early, it really loaded that rear end. And as you went through the center of the corner, you heard the engine just go a little, and that's not you on the throttle, because it seems like you're pretty flat out at that point. That's really because you've loaded the rear of the cart pretty early in the corner. It didn't have the grip to just drive off. So in the middle of the corner, it just gave a little bit of a hop, and that little bit of a hop stutter in the engine maybe cost you, half a tenth down the straightaway there. It's not a lot. Like I said, that's actually a really solid corner right there, but I do feel like we can try to attack that entry of the corner a little bit. And we finish off the lap here. And again, that's a very solid lap. So if I were to kind of pick up your three largest things that we can work on moving forward here. Number one is challenging the brake zone in the slower corners. I don't really hear the brakes at all. Usually, if you're really challenging those corners, you maybe hear a little bit of brake chatter on the initial input of the braking, and then as you start to release, you'll hear that nice smooth release, and the engine RPMs come up. That will really help. The other thing is using the rubber properly. There's two corners that we talked about, especially earlier in the lap, where we're hanging that wheel just outside the rubber, and it's just making that little bit of oversteer. And when the track is cold or there's not that much grip, or you're on a harder tire, normally you need to pay even more attention about really sticking in underneath that rubber to use that grip properly. If you're outside that rubber, it's really going to affect your grip, especially on a little bit harder tire like this one. So really focus on that. And the third one is your throttle application. In general, especially in the faster corners, it's really good. But as you can see in the slowest corner on the track, that's where we're having a little bit of struggle. Those RPMs really drop down. We're in a lower gear, so even more sensitive to your throttle input. And we got a little bit of oversteer because we were too quick to throttle, and we just need to be a little bit more progressive with it. We like to think of the throttle as a dimmer switch, not an on-off switch. So as you bring it up, try to be a little bit more progressive. And the further up that RPM range and the further up that progression, the more aggressive you can be. So that first 20%, maybe you need to crack it open a little bit slower, and then you can really start to get after it once those hands get straight and you've loaded the rear a little bit. If you haven't really loaded the rear yet and you try just to hammer on the throttle, that's when you get that wheel spin. That's when you get that little huckabuck and you get that slide. So like I said, a really solid foundation here. It would be interesting to see in the future, maybe some of your data, if you can send over some of your data with the laps, and we can definitely go in a little bit more in depth with your braking, which is where I see, the biggest improvement. So thank you again. Have a look at the notes here, and good luck, and hopefully we'll see some improvement and catch up with you soon.